Imagine this. You're sitting in a dim room. The phone buzzes again. Another message, another voice in your ear. Another cry for help that's not yours to answer. You're drowning in other people's expectations. You say yes when your soul whispers no. You smile when you're depleted. You hold space for others while nobody holds space for you. And then one day, quietly, invisibly, you stop. You stop answering texts immediately. You stop engaging in conversations that drain your spirit. You stop being emotionally available to everyone, all the time. You stop explaining yourself. And something radical begins to happen. Silence rushes in. Not the kind of silence that makes you feel lonely, but the kind that feels like a return to your true self. Stillness becomes your sanctuary. The energy you once scattered like seeds in the wind now circles back to you, forming something sacred, something powerful, your presence. But this new presence is not welcomed by all. People start to ask, "Are you okay?" They say, "You've changed." Some withdraw, others accuse. The world, it seems, was never built to honor those who stop giving endlessly. Yet in that withdrawal, in that tension, something ancient and alchemical begins to stir. 2. The paradox. Why does choosing silence feel more violent to others than being perpetually available feels to you? Why does reclaiming your energy spark more fear in others than self-abandonment ever did in yourself? This is not just a personal shift. It's a revolt against invisible chains, a rejection of the unspoken rule that says your worth is measured by your accessibility. And this choice, the choice to no longer be available, is far more than a boundary. It is a philosophical act, a spiritual rebellion. 3. The ancient dilemma. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But what he didn't add, at least not in those words, is the cost. Because when you become who you are, you must also let go of who the world wanted you to be. And that version, the ever available, ever accommodating you, was never you to begin with. Every culture has its rituals, but modern society's most invisible ritual is self-erasure. Sacrificing your boundaries for belonging, sacrificing your time for approval, sacrificing your truth for comfort, sacrificing your emotional energy for the illusion of connection. And so we perform. We perform okay. We perform patience. We perform support. We perform a self who is always there for others, while being nowhere for ourselves. But when you stop performing, you become unfamiliar, even threatening. 4. The emotional crack. It starts as a whisper. Maybe I don't need to explain everything. Then, maybe I don't need to be available right now. And finally, maybe I was never obligated to carry what was never mine. But that whisper isn't just emotional. It's existential, because underneath it is a deeper, darker question. Who am I when I am no longer what others expect me to be? That's the terrifying gift of emotional unavailability, not in the cold, detached sense we often associate with the term, but in the sacred sense, the ability to withdraw from the world's projections and return to the self that existed before the world molded you. 5. What changes? Everything. People treat you differently. They question your silence. They misinterpret your boundaries. They label your evolution as selfishness. But here's the secret they don't understand. When you stop being emotionally available to everyone, you don't become cold. You become clear. You don't become distant. You become defined. Because in that silence, in that sacred no, in that refusal to leak your energy in 1,000 directions, you are finally choosing yourself. And here is the unsettling truth no one told you. Most people aren't afraid of your absence. They're afraid of your autonomy. Because autonomy cannot be controlled. And nothing terrifies the world more than a person who no longer needs its validation. 6. The great question. So here we are. standing at the edge of a haunting truth. What if the very thing you thought would alienate you, your silence, your boundaries, your refusal to be endlessly available, is actually the door to your power? What if the emotional chaos you once thought was connection was actually the distraction, keeping you from meeting yourself? And what if the silence that frightens others is the only thing that can set you free? Let's go deeper. The hidden problem and its psychological/philosophical roots. 2. The hidden problem. Why you were never meant to be whole. You were not born to serve the world's emotional hunger, but somewhere along the way, you were trained by parents, teachers, society, to believe that love is earned through sacrifice, that belonging requires emotional labor, and that silence is dangerous. You were not raised to be whole. You were raised to be useful, and therein lies the hidden problem. The psychological roots of constant availability run deep, deeper than simple people-pleasing. It is not just about being liked. It is about survival, social, emotional, and existential. Carl Jung called it the persona, the mask we wear to function in society. It is not inherently bad. We all need a face that helps us navigate the social world. But when the mask becomes fused with the face, we forget who we were underneath. The persona is a mask for the collective psyche, Jung wrote. And that's the secret. When you're always emotionally available to others, you're not showing your true self. You're performing a role, the good daughter, the supportive friend, the loyal partner, the dependable employee. Beneath that role lies a stranger, the real you. 3. The psychological wound. We are taught that to be loved, we must be needed. But being needed is not the same as being seen. And over time, this creates a wound, a subtle, quiet fracture in the soul. You begin to associate emotional labor with identity. You begin to confuse presence with worth. And slowly, you lose your edges. What happens when a person loses their psychological edges? They become a container for other people's chaos. They become emotional sponges. They attract the broken and the draining because they've never been taught to say no, only how to hold on. 4. Jung and the shadow. Carl Jung proposed that every human being carries a shadow, the repressed, hidden parts of ourselves that we are either ashamed of or unaware of. And one of the most terrifying shadows in modern society is the refusal to be needed. Why? Because it threatens the entire social order. To withdraw your emotional availability is to say, I do not exist to comfort your wounds at the cost of reopening mine. And this is terrifying to those who rely on your emotional compliance to maintain their own stability. The more whole you become, the more dangerous you are to a world built on fragmentation. 5. Cultural hypnosis. We live in a culture that worships busyness and glorifies burnout. A culture that tells you, if you're not answering immediately, you're selfish. If you're not emotionally open, you're cold. If you're not sacrificing for others, you're useless. This is not love. This is hypnosis. Arthur Schopenhauer once wrote that compassion is the basis of morality. But compassion without boundaries is not moral, it's martyrdom. And martyrdom, while noble on the surface, often masks an unconscious desire to be validated through pain. We live in a world addicted to emotional currency. And when you stop spending your soul to be loved, you become emotionally wealthy in a way most cannot comprehend. 6. Sartre's trap, the gaze of the other. Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, believed that we are haunted by the gaze of the other, that we become objects in other people's realities. And so we live to be seen, modifying our behavior, tailoring our personality, offering our emotions on a platter just to be liked. But here's the tragedy. The more you adjust yourself to be seen, the less you can see yourself. You are not meant to live as an image in someone else's mind. You are meant to live as a soul in your own body. So ask yourself, whose gaze are you performing for? Whose approval are you emotionally financing with your own exhaustion? whose comfort is being prioritized over your inner clarity. 7. Viktor Frankl's invitation to meaning. Viktor Frankl, survivor of the Holocaust and founder of logotherapy, once said, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And this is where transformation begins. You cannot change the world's addiction to your availability. You cannot force people to respect silence. You cannot make them understand your boundaries. But you can change what you give your energy to. You can change who has access to your emotional reserves. You can change whether you continue to betray yourself in the name of belonging. Because the hidden problem is not that people take from you. It's that you never learn to say, 'I am not here to be emptied.'" 8. The philosophical wound, the hunger to be needed. Nietzsche once said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But what if your why is built on being needed? What if your purpose has been hijacked by the desire to be relevant in other people's lives, even if it costs your own peace? That's the soul trap. You mistake being indispensable for being loved. You confuse being emotionally useful for being whole. And that's the root of emotional availability. Addiction. You fear that if you stop being needed, you'll stop being loved. But that's the lie. The truth is this: if love must be earned through emotional exhaustion, it was never love to begin with. You are not here to be consumed. You are here to be conscious. And that shift from consumption to consciousness is the revolution waiting to unfold in your life. Next, the unseen consequences. What happens when you stay available for too long? There is a quiet violence in always being available. Not the kind that leaves bruises on the skin, but the kind that erodes the soul. One unanswered no, one buried emotion, one forced smile at a time. You don't notice it immediately. It begins subtly. You're a little more tired after every conversation. You feel slightly resentful after every yes. You smile when your insides ache. You give when you haven't even fed your own spirit. And you tell yourself, this is what love looks like. You call it loyalty. You call it maturity. You call it connection. But the body knows the truth. 1. The body keeps score. Neuroscientist and trauma expert Bessel van der Kolk said it plainly. The body keeps the score. When you remain emotionally available beyond your capacity, your nervous system begins to deteriorate. Your cortisol levels stay high. Your immune system weakens. Chronic fatigue sets in, not from lack of sleep, but from spiritual depletion. You stop being able to tell the difference between exhaustion and identity. You think, maybe I'm just not strong enough. But the truth is, you were never meant to hold the weight of everyone's chaos. Your empathy becomes your poison. Your kindness becomes your cage. Your availability becomes your slow collapse. 2. Cognitive dissonance, the silent scream. The mind starts to fracture under the weight of the lie. I have to be here for everyone, or I am nothing. Cognitive dissonance sets in. You feel both needed and invisible, loved and used, present and completely hollow. You begin to forget what your own emotions feel like. You hesitate before expressing anger. You question your sadness. You hide your loneliness beneath a facade of strength. Because somewhere along the way, you were taught that strength looks like this: being always ready, always there, always emotionally open. But that's not strength. That's performative survival. 3. The myth of the good person. You were conditioned to be the good person, the dependable one, the selfless one, the one who never says, I can't. But the myth of the good person is a trap. It keeps you emotionally enslaved to other people's comfort. And so they resist your boundaries, not because they are cruel, but because they are addicted to your sacrifice. 10. The silent scream of the soul. Eventually, your soul begins to scream, not with noise, but with symptoms. Depression, anxiety, numbness, a strange fatigue that sleep cannot fix. Because the soul is not meant to be eternally accessible. It is meant to be sacred. It is meant to retreat. It is meant to say no. And when you ignore that truth long enough, the soul begins to shut down, not in punishment, but in self-preservation. The unseen trap. The trap is this. You think staying available keeps you connected, but in truth, it keeps you from ever meeting yourself. Now, what happens when you break the rules? What happens when you choose silence over explanation? What happens when you become unavailable, truly, unapologetically, mystically unavailable? That is where your rebellion begins. 4. The rebellion. How to break free. There comes a moment, a sacred rupture, when the pain of staying available becomes greater than the fear of being misunderstood. It arrives quietly, not as rage, not as a declaration, but as a final breath beneath 1,000 silent suffocations. And in that moment, you do something radical. You withdraw. You do not explain. You do not announce. You simply disappear from the spaces that once drained you. And at first, it feels like dying. Because a part of you is dying, the part addicted to being needed. But what is dying is not your essence. What is dying is your compliance. And in its place, something ancient rises, sovereignty. 1. The first rebellion, choosing silence. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is presence, intensified. It is not the absence of communication. It is the reclamation of intention. You begin to speak less, not out of resentment, but because your words are no longer for public consumption. You no longer feel the need to validate your boundaries with an essay. You stop responding to every emotional summons like an on-call therapist. And people notice. They call it cold. They call it selfish. But what they're really seeing is unfamiliarity. They are meeting a version of you who is no longer available for extraction. This is not cruelty. This is clarity. 2. The second rebellion, energy conservation. Carl Jung taught that the psyche is like a living organism, governed by energy. When you leak energy into every conversation, every guilt trip, every drama that was never yours to begin with, you deplete the self. But now, you begin to conserve. You become aware of psychic costs. Every exchange is no longer just time, it is soul. And so, like a minimalist guarding sacred space, you begin to filter. Who gets your time? Who gets your truth? Who earns your openness? This isn't gatekeeping. This is energetic responsibility. Because not everyone should have access to your inner temple. 3. The third rebellion, becoming unreadable. In a world obsessed with transparency, mystery is a weapon. When you become unreadable, you become uncontainable. You no longer telegraph your emotions for others to interpret. You no longer make your wounds legible so others feel comfortable. You allow others to misunderstand you, and you make peace with it. This is power, the ability to be misinterpreted and remain unbothered. Because truth doesn't need defending, it needs inhabiting. And when you stop performing, you realize something terrifying and liberating. You were never truly known. You were just easily read. Now, they must earn access to the real you. 4. The fourth rebellion, the strategic no. You begin to say no, but not loudly, not as a sword. You say it with subtlety, precision, finality. It becomes a form of art, a sacred knife that cuts through obligation, a key that unlocks the prison of politeness. You say no to conversations that lead nowhere, no to roles that shrink you, no to the exhausting performance of being okay. And in each no, something remarkable happens. You create space, and in that space, the authentic self begins to breathe again. 5. The fifth rebellion, becoming intolerant to inauthenticity. Once you taste real alignment, true solitude, sacred silence, you become violently allergic to pretense. You can no longer tolerate forced conversations, guilt-driven connections, emotional enmeshment masquerading as love. You become a mirror and others feel it. They either rise to meet your depth or they recoil from their own reflection. But you do not shrink, because finally, you have stopped abandoning yourself. 6. Historical echoes, those who withdrew. History remembers those who withdrew, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. Siddhartha Gautama left the palace of pleasure and became the Buddha. Diogenes rejected societal norms and lived in radical simplicity. Emily Dickinson withdrew into her home and gave the world immortal poetry. Marcus Aurelius found stillness in an empire of chaos. Their silence was not passive. It was a statement, a revolt, a refusal to lose the self to the noise of the world. You are now entering that lineage. 7. The sixth rebellion, living without apology. You no longer apologize for your boundaries. You no longer dilute your truth to keep the peace. You no longer seek permission to protect your peace. This is spiritual adulthood, the capacity to live aligned without the need for external approval. You stop explaining your silence. You stop translating your decisions for others to understand. You stop fearing the phrase, "You've changed." Because the truth is, you were supposed to. And now, you no longer fear the consequence of being misunderstood. You fear the consequence of self-abandonment more. 8. The final rebellion. You no longer chase peace, you become it. You become a quiet storm. People don't know how to define you anymore. You don't engage in emotional ping-pong. You don't respond to everything. Your presence says, "I exist beyond explanation." And in this stillness, you become magnetic. Not because you are available, but because you are whole. The rebellion is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is sacred. It is internal. And it is permanent. Because once you break free from the identity of the perpetually available, you do not go back. You do not long for the past. You mourn it. And then you transcend. The threshold. You are now standing at the threshold. 1 foot in the old world of emotional exhaustion. 1 foot in the new world of spiritual sovereignty. And what you choose next will define not just your relationships, but your life. Because this is more than emotional boundaries. This is the beginning of inner revolution. Now, what is the deepest truth waiting on the other side of silence? That's where we go next. Part 5. The ultimate truth. The final, most powerful realization. Word count, 1000. 5. The ultimate truth. The final, most powerful realization. There is a moment, silent and unannounced, when the rebellion ends. Not because you return to who you were, but because something deeper than rebellion emerges. Peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from avoiding conflict. Not the polite peace bought with self-erasure, but a profound, elemental peace. The kind that comes from alignment. And when you reach this place, you realize a terrifying and liberating truth. You were never meant to be available to everyone. You were meant to be available to truth. 1. The disappearance of the old self. You do not mourn your past life in the way you once feared. You look back and see a shadow, a ghost of someone who lived for validation, who traded vitality for approval, who called exhaustion a badge of honor. That self is gone now, and in its place stands a presence that is untouchable, not because it is distant, but because it is rooted. You are no longer reachable through guilt. You are no longer seduced by obligation. You are no longer defined by what you give away. Because now, your value is no longer measured by your emotional accessibility. It is measured by your authenticity. 2. Love without sacrifice. You once believed that to be loved, you had to bleed. That love required pain. That connection required compromise. But now you see, love that demands the death of your truth is not love. It is consumption. Real love, the kind that nourishes rather than depletes, does not fear your silence. It does not collapse at your boundaries. It does not interpret your solitude as abandonment. Instead, it honors your edges. It stands still when you retreat. It listens when you are silent. And if it cannot, it was never love to begin with. 3. Carl Jung's completion of the self. Jung taught that the journey of individuation, the process of becoming, Whole is the most important task of the human being. Not happiness, not success, not being needed. Wholeness. And wholeness requires separation from illusions, from roles, from the parts of yourself that were built only to survive, not to thrive. When you stop being available, you do not become lonely. You become integrated. You begin to notice things that were once invisible. The sacred rhythm of your breath, the quiet power of doing nothing, the way your intuition speaks only in stillness. This is not withdrawal. This is return. Return to self. Return to soul. Return to source. 4. The paradox of true power. Here is the great paradox. When you stop being available to everyone, you become more powerful than ever before. Why? Because power is not in what you offer. It's in what you withhold. Not as a weapon, but as a declaration. I am no longer currency in someone else's story. This kind of power is magnetic, not because it demands attention, but because it emits depth. You become a mystery again. And in that mystery, people no longer approach you with entitlement. They approach you with reverence. Not everyone will stay, but those who remain will meet you at your frequency, not your availability. 5. The final liberation, no longer needing to be understood. This is the most sacred freedom. You no longer need to be understood. You stop justifying your boundaries. You stop proving your goodness. You stop fearing misinterpretation. You let people project. You let them guess. You let them walk away. Because the moment you stop needing to be understood, you finally understand yourself. 6. Silence as a spiritual portal. Silence is no longer empty. It is a portal. In silence, you hear the voice beneath all others, your own. In silence, you remember what the noise made you forget. In silence, you meet the divine. Jung believed that within the unconscious lies the gateway to the divine self. And the unconscious speaks not in noise, but in symbols, in dreams, in stillness. When you retreat from availability, you create a temple for that self to speak. And what it says will not always be comforting, but it will always be true.